Welcome to the second installment of NJIT SIGGRAPH's tutorial series, Adobe Illustrator, Character Illustration. So if you look, it should be under Events, the current event, and then it'll be these two links right here. Right now we're going to start with the character files. So I'll just start it up from my side so you can see what's going on. I'm on a different version of Illustrator than you guys because I'm running it off of my laptop, but it should still be the same as far as what I'm showing you. So when you open up the character designs file, the folder, it'll have two images. There's just the image and then this other texture, which I'll get to later. So you can either just drag and drop it in, or you can go to File, Place, and then find wherever you downloaded it.
Does it matter the size of the thing?
No, it can be any size, at least for now. Later on, if you were doing this, say, for an actual print job that you're going to do, or if it was specified to you by a client, it would matter. But for now, just going over the basics of how you would start off with character illustration. So the file that I uploaded there was a character designed by Rachel Correz that we used, that we were trying to use for a game at Global Game Jam. And the idea is that you can start from scratch and drawing from Illustrator, but as with what a lot of people do with Photoshop as well, is they like to sketch out the ideas by hand to just get an idea for what they want their project to look like. And then similar to what some people do in Photoshop, it's a matter of tracing over what you drew and then tweaking it as you see fit in Illustrator. So one good practice to start thinking about is when you create your own layer schemes, you want to start from the beginning, being mindful of the layers that you're creating and what you're naming them, because oftentimes you'll get files from different people where either everything's in one big group or they're all in mismanaged layers all over the place, and then when you start to manage it later on. So if you're interested, towards the end I can show how you would be able to take the character you create here in Illustrator and then build it so that it can be brought into Flash if you want to create like a quick Flash walk cycle for it. It's not too different than what Brandon was talking about last week with his Maya walk cycle. So from here, you can just start off with making sure the background image that you brought in is on its own layer and then locking it, just so you can prevent yourself from moving it. And then you create a new layer. We can probably start off with the shirt. So the shirt will probably be the layer that'll be on the top above everything else. So you just double click the layer, you can call it shirt, and then you take out the pen tool, so you press P. And what you should do, I found a good practice to do, is you can have strokes on by default, but what that does is it prevents you from being mindful of the geometry that you're creating in Illustrator. So if you take the strokes, which is the box that has the hollowed out region, you select it and you pick no swatches, and then you can pick whatever color you want for the shirt. For what I'm going to be doing, most of the things are going to be placeholder colors, and you can change it as you get later on in the process. And then what I like to do also is you take the same fill and you drop down the opacity, so you start to see what you're working with, and then when you start to develop other layers, it'll help you manage everything that you're working with. And so once you have the pen tool that you select with P, just a simple thing, what you can do is you can take your pen tool, you go to the next point, and then if you drag it, it brings out these handles which allow you to develop the curves of your shape. Or conversely, if you just take it and you click on the next point, it creates a straight line. And then what ends up happening is you can make these straight lines just fine, but then once you start to create the curves to it, Illustrator by default, sometimes the curves don't exactly fall in line with what you want them to be. And so I'll go back to what I was saying before. Transparency didn't apply. But once you bring down transparency, you see what's going on. And if you want to better fine-tune what you're creating, so if I were to make this point right here, what you can do is you can select the handle, and then if there's only one handle like it shows right here, you can convert it up on this anchor points button right there, and it creates the two handles. And one feature of Illustrator that a lot of people aren't always immediately aware of is that if you hold Alt while selecting the handle, you can adjust one handle completely independently of the other. And that allows you to better fine-tune what you're creating. So what may end up happening is, fortunately Illustrator is being really helpful today. There's been often times where when you're creating your curves, they start to go all over the place, and then it becomes a matter of trying to fix everything as you start working. And so that's how you make the shirt. And the same thing as you did with the previous layer, it's best to lock things once you're done with it. For this instance, it doesn't directly matter the order that I lay out the layers, but for now, I'll put it on top of the shirt layer. And so next things that you can start to create are the legs and the arms, and this is where naming things starts to help a lot. So I'll probably start working with the feet right now. So I'll create a layer of feet, and the way Illustrator treats their layers is that every layer essentially acts like a folder, and so you can have nested layers within them. And so you just create a layer and you drag it directly inside of it. So I'll probably make one layer for left, and I'll make one layer for the right foot. So if I'm working with the left foot and making sure that's selected, then that's when I start to take out the pen tool. If you don't lock the previous layers, what may end up happening is when you draw, you may have selected that the left foot layer, but it'll start drawing in shirt, and that's when it starts to become a bit difficult to figure out where all of your assets are. So same thing what we did before, maybe I'll change the color to something else. It's all temporary for now, so maybe I'll use a blue. So tracing what you did before. If I'm going through anything too fast, just let me know. If there's anything that I didn't directly explain, I can go over it in better detail. So I guess this is when you start to see where things get to be a bit tricky. So the next point that I created, you see how the foot is a bit warped right there? That's where multiple things can come into play. So what you can do is there's a V, which is the selection tool, and then there's A, which is the direct selection tool. So what V will do is V will select this whole asset entirely, but if you use A to create the direct selection tool, then you can manage the individual points of the shape that you're creating. And so when you have this selected, you can also, if you go to the pen tool, there's multiple options that you can use. So if you hold down the button, there's the pen tool, and then there's add anchor point, delete anchor point, and convert anchor point tool. The shortcuts for these are P, plus, minus, and Shift C respectively. So what you can do is you can add points by pressing plus or by making this the add anchor point tool. It's the same thing. You can create this anchor point and start to move things around. But even then, if you start moving the handles like I was telling you before, if you don't press Alt beforehand, then they start to move at the same time. An additional point that may end up giving you a hiccup later on is that if you grab the point and then press Alt after you've already selected it, what it may do is create additional geometry. So if you see right there, it created this shape completely independent of what's already there. So what you want to be mindful is that when you select the point we're using the white arrow, the direct selection, you want to make sure Alt is selected. Alt is held before you do anything, and then that's when you can do things separately. And the other point that I can bring up is if you had already created a shape and you want to continue from where you last left off, if you use the direct selection tool to select the last point that you created, if you press P to bring up the pen tool, you can see this, it may be a bit difficult to see on the projector, but there's a little slash that shows up next to the pen tool itself. And what that slash means is that you'll be continuing a previously created line. One other thing that you can do, it may be a bit difficult for me, just because the way the monitor is squashed. If you go to Window, New Window, what it'll do is it'll create a duplicate of the same window that you're working in. And so what you can do is, if you're oftentimes finding yourself that you're working in a zoomed in environment, what you can do is you can open up another window, and it's identical in the sense that whatever you do in one window affects the other. So you can always see what you're creating in a zoomed out view, so you always have context. So what may end up happening is something will look, it'll look perfect when you zoom in, but when you zoom out, it may look considerably off from what you were expecting it to be.
What was that? Window?
So if you go to Window and select New Window, what it'll do is it'll create the same thing, but if you notice there's a colon and then a number. So it's telling you how many open windows you have of what you are currently working within. So what'll end up happening is, I have a dual monitor set up in my studio, and so I can always have another monitor open so I can see what I'm doing both in macro, zoomed out, and then in micro, what I'm working on close up. And so you don't always have to be perfect on the first go. This is just a matter of me trying to show you the best practices to go about creating your shapes. You can always refine things later. And then a benefit to what I was saying of making your fills transparent is that if you were creating this in mind, with flash animation in mind, what you may end up doing is you can create your regular geometry, but you typically want to create something that goes further inside the overlapping shapes. So what will end up happening is, if you create this extra shape, it'll be masked by the shirt once you put the shirt on top of the feet layer. And so what you can do is, if you select it, in Flash they have a bone tool, but you can also just pose everything in Illustrator if you'd like. If you select the shape and if you press R, you notice this crosshair that shows up. If you still have the rotating tool pulled up, you select on the crosshair and you can drag it to where you'd want it to be. So you can put it wherever you'd like. It probably would make the most sense to put it further within the shirt. And so it's hard to see. Maybe if I change the color of the leg, I'll make it something like yellow. So can you see the crosshair better now? It's now green. So you'd probably put it up there, and then by having the crosshair, that determines where everything's going to be rotated from. So you can imagine it moving like this. The view that we're working with directly is one that's a front view, so you may need to do other things like shade one leg that's in the background and one in the foreground, because this would be a character that's walking directly at the camera. But you can imagine how you can start posing things if you create this extra shape within, nested within another. So what I'll do is I'll undo and put the foot back where it was, and then you'll create the other foot as well. And if it's not transparent, like I said before, you can always, while you're doing it, drag down the slider and then continue from where you left off. Are there any questions you have as I'm working on the foot right now? Okay. For now, I probably won't finesse things too much, but you can see how you can do that as well. So the next step is once you create your feet, you can lock that layer and go to the arms. So what I'll probably do is I'll maybe going a bit faster. Um, the process is the same more or less for this part. What I want to get to is once I create the arms, I want to show you a couple of tricks that you can do in terms of creating the shapes for the head and for the hair as well. And another thing to keep in mind is that though you have the sketch as your background, you're not locked into it in the sense that you have to do it exactly like you want. What you can end up doing is what I also end up that usually ends up happening when I work myself is that I'll create the initial sketch, but then as I start working on Illustrator, I'll start to change things as I see them, as I feel them appropriate. I guess I can get into what I was talking about before. So if you find that you create your layer system, but you may have found out that the layer that you created may not have had anything applied into it. So what you can do is if you select the layer, and if you want to move it to another layer, in this panel right here, you notice that it says arms, it says what's selected within it, and then it tells you where the actual contents are located. So right now I have the left arm layer and both arms are contained within it. So knowing that I want the right one to be in the right layer, I'll select this little teal square. This color changes depending on whatever the layer color is right here, and you simply drag that box into another layer. And so that way everything is where it needs to be. Let me see. So there's two different approaches that you can use in dealing with the head. You can either create the head geometry first, or you can create the hair first. What some people may end up doing, which I'll try to save you the hassle of going about doing it, is they'll create them and they'll have them completely independent of each other, and because they're doing that, they may end up making more work than is necessary. So what I'll do is I'll outline the head fairly quickly. I'll probably refine it later on if there's more time available. So what I'll do right now, which can save a lot of time, is that I can make the shape of the hair fairly quickly, and I don't have to think about where the head intersects. So what some people may do is they'll create the shape of the hair, and what they'll do is they'll just put the head directly in front of it, masking it, and then they'll call it a day. For the most part, that could be fine. But as you start to apply other filters to layers, like maybe if you put a glow effect or or if you start to adjust it later down the line, you may end up finding out that because you saved yourself a couple seconds, you may end up um, making hours of work to deal with later down the line. So what you can do right here is if I have the hair shaped like this, and because I made it transparent, you can see how there's this overlap between them. What you can do is you can take this head layer, so I'll unlock it really quickly, and a shortcut that'll probably save you a lot of time is if you select the shape using either the V arrow or the A arrow. You select it with Control C. What I'll do is I'll paste into the hair layer, so I'm going to keep it completely independent from this head that we created earlier, and you press Control F. So what Control F does is it pastes it directly on top of wherever it was, whereas if you press Control V, it'll end up putting it any which way, and it may not be where you want it to be. And so creating it in the hair layer allows it so that this head isn't impacted, and what you can do is if you go to Window and then Pathfinder, it gives you this option of different interactions you can do with different shapes. So what you can do, for the most part, divide usually does the job right in terms of what you want done. So what I'll do is I'll select the duplicated head, and I'll select the hair by holding shift so that both are selected at the same time. You'll know that they're selected because of what's shown in this transparency area box, and you select divide. So what it does is it creates out of all those overlapping segments, it creates a shape for each one of those. Because we have this head here, we can be fairly confident that if we delete whatever is here, it won't affect the head that we'll be using eventually. And additionally, what it did was it created something that was it created two overlaps of the two different shapes, and so you can delete both of these just fine. And so what you end up getting is you get a hair shape that's exactly the shape that you wanted, and you get a head that's exactly the shape that you wanted. This has its benefits, and this could also have been done the opposite way, so you could have created the hair detailed and then created, say, a big ellipse for a head, and then had the head shape generated from that. It's all a matter of preference, or whichever asset you thought was better or more important to you, the face or the hair. So now we have the hair. The main other things left to create are the eyes and the nose, and the other detail. For these, you still want to do your diligence in terms of naming things correctly, but it's less significant in the sense that you're going to typically be manipulating the head and the hair and the eyes all together as one unit. I mean, unless if you have something in mind where you want to create something, I guess like the eyes popping out of the person's head because they're really excited, or their hair falling off for a similar reason. And just to explain what I did, is that if you take the ellipse tool, if you drag it normally, it'll just create an ellipse based on the beginning and the ending points that you used. But if you hold shift, then it keeps the constraints and allows you to make a circle. So that's what I'm using to create the eyeballs and the pupils inside of them. And same thing like I said before, I'm pressing Control F to make a copy directly on top of where you are, and then if you hold shift, it allows you to move in the cardinal directions relative to where the first point was, so that way you can make sure that everything lines up. If you want to, you can even, um, if you go to View and then Show Rulers, it allows you to, like I mentioned earlier on in the presentation, if you knew that you had to stay within a certain page size, either 11 by 17, 8.5 by 11, or whatever you're working with, it gives you the ruler. And then also, if you select the ruler and you drag down, it creates guides for you to start to line things up. One thing to keep cognizant of is that these lines, these guidelines that it's creating, they are assets in the sense that they can be moved. They can be moved like everything else, and they also are tied to a specific layer. So a habit that I like to do is just create a layer called guides, make sure they're within them, so that whenever I want to see them, I can turn them on and off, or I can lock them, depending on whatever I need. A quick shortcut, if for whatever reason, if you don't, or if you aren't mindful of creating layers for your own guides, is if you press Control Shift and let me just double check this. Oh no, not Control Shift. If you just press Control and semicolon, it hides the guides. So this comes into play not only for guides, but if you were designing a print document and you created bleeds that go out in this region over here. And another shortcut, because the bottom portion of my screen is cut off, if you press X, it allows you to switch between whatever's active, so either the strokes or the fill. So that's what I'm using to switch between. Normally, with everything else I created fills, but for the nose, it doesn't exactly make sense to have a fill. So I'll select it, and then you can press Shift X. Okay, so that's the hotkey. If you press Shift X, it allows you to change it between a fill and a stroke. So maybe I'll just call this a nose. I'll make another for mouth. And this may or may not be lazy, but I know what Illustrator does is if you have an open point like this, what it'll do is it'll directly connect it, not with a stroke. If you select the fill and it's not a complete shape, what it'll do is it'll create exactly what you think it'll do. It'll make a fill connecting these lines, and that's it bears reference to the shape that we had before with the drawing underneath. And that's up to you whether you want to create that or if you want to create a separate fill directly underneath it. Press Control F to make it so that everything lines up and then have your fill separate. Sometimes having your fills separate can be beneficial. So what will end up happening is this will probably come up more in the logo segment of the tutorial, but if you create a shape like so, I'll get rid of the fill, and so I'll give it something really thick, like I'll maybe make it like a 10-point line. What'll end up happening is a lot of logos that I've made for different companies or different people who have requested them, if I have a stroke like this, what'll end up happening is if you don't pay attention to your settings, so if you go to Object, Transform, and Scale, there's two different ways that Illustrator will work. So I'll turn on Preview so you can see what I mean. If you have this selected where it says Scale, Strokes, and Effects, and so if I make it say 200%, what it'll do is it'll do exactly what you think. It'll make this thickness twice as big. But sometimes what you're trying to do is you're trying to scale a document that you set up at 8.5 by 11 to 11 by 17, And so sometimes you want everything to scale uniformly or sometimes you don't. And so what you can do is you can turn this off and it'll keep that same thickness. So maybe a document, you know that these lines are supposed to be at one point always regardless. So what'll end up happening is if you create your strokes separately from your fill, you can also do things like you select the path. If you go to Object, Path, and then Outline Stroke, what it'll do is it'll create that same stroke, but it'll make it a fill. So that way you can manage everything. So that's literally just giving you another dimension that you can work with in terms of making your drawings look exactly like you want them to. And I guess I'm kind of getting tired of the fact that she looks a bit yellow. So I'll probably pick something that doesn't look like it's from The Simpsons.
Quick question.
Yes?
So what's the advantage of naming the layers instead of just having, like with Illustrator you can have things on layers, name everything differently, and still separate.
Well, what I end up doing is, so if you imagine this as something that's going to be animated, and if you have these all in clearly laid out layers, when you import this into Flash, it knows what your layers are. So if you're trying to move things, like if you want to move the leg, if these were all together,
Oh, we just chop it off.
yes, so you can manage everything separately. If they were all together, then if you want to rotate the leg, you would have to break it apart in Flash and then manage it afterwards. It
So it's really just for like a workflow.
It's definitely for a workflow thing. And you wouldn't be surprised. I've gotten so many files from people where they wanted me to make it better or do something with it. And another thing that can happen is I do it sometimes just to be either lazy or it just helps the workflow that I want to work within. So what I'll do is I'll create a bunch of things, like I'll select these arms, the feet and the shirt, and I'll copy it over here, and just for convenience sake I'll make it like a group. And so that's just so that if I use the black arrow to select it, the selection tool, I can easily just bring everything together. But the only thing is, if you make something a group, what ends up happening is that it destroys the layer setup that you created. So if I select this thing, it creates this thing called group. And so it's just another thing to keep in mind. I think I've gotten less dependent on using groups, because what using groups does is you treat it the same way that other people treat layers. So what ends up happening is, I've done this before, I'll have a group within a group within a group. So what and the worst part is, some of the things that are inside all of those groups are important, like text. So like if a client said, can you change the text for me? I'll select it, and then I'll select it, and then I'll select it again. All that just to change the text, and then I don't know. It takes like an extra maybe 10 seconds to be mindful of your layers, but then when you're like crunch time and you need to have something done within like the next 5 minutes because you have your boss hounding on you, you're like, I wish I took that time just to make it right the first time. So what can I do? I think for now this covers a lot of the basics that you need in terms of creating your character. So like I said, probably the last step that I would do for here is, just because I created the layers chronologically, in the sense that I set them up at the time I created them. I guess I can also tell you what I did right now. There's just, when you end up using software for a while, you don't pay attention to what you're doing. If you want to select, or if you want to hide or lock layers in mass, what you can do is, typically a person will just click the lock. What you can do is, if you click the lock and then you drag, it'll just apply that to everything else. It's just a quick little shortcut. So I'll take the shirt and I'll put it on top of everything else. And then what I'll probably do is I'll select everything that I created. Another shortcut, it's a shortcut and also a better way about going things, is that if you can keep everything organized, and probably one of the best reasons to keep everything organized is that a lot of architecture students will tell you that they like AutoCAD a lot better than Illustrator in some regards, and one of those regards is that it's a lot easier to select things in other programs. In Illustrator, it can be really finicky. So, like, I can select something right here. If I use the direct selection tool, so maybe I want specific vertices, I can select it, but then if I go over it again, then it starts to overwrite what I selected and inverts it, and it drives you insane. So what you can do is, say I only want to select the shirt, you notice these little bubbles that show right next to the layer. If you select it, it'll select everything within that layer, so you don't have to go micro trying to zoom in and select exactly what you wanted. It basically just builds it in there. And you can also drag things using that same box I told you from before. So I'll select it. And what I can do, let me see. See, typically that would be better. The only difference though is the way that I managed opacity. I want to see something real quick. So this may end up helping you later on. If I select this circle and I change the opacity here, that does it independent. So what you can do, instead of what I was doing before, where I just selected it and then moved the slider, if I was mindful of the fact that I did create the layers, it's better to use that circle that I was talking about before and drag the slider there, because unfortunately, the shapes I made before, you have to select them manually to change the opacity. Oh, and I guess one other thing that I can do, okay, that brings up a bunch of things I can do. I got a couple ideas to show you. So if you bring up the opacity, and make your eyeballs not purple. What you can do is, if you know that you had a very specific list of colors that you created, or if you liked what you created and you want to maybe put it into something else, if you select everything and you select this this new color group right here, what you do is make it something that you'll remember. So you'll say character colors. And so what it'll do is it'll pull out every color that you used and it'll make it into a folder so you can readily call it up whenever you want to. So you're basically creating your if you're painting, it'd be your easel, your palette that you're going to work with. And another thing that's pretty cool that you can do with it is if maybe you're going for something like I can't remember if they did it in Foster's. I remember they did it in an old cartoon show, Samurai Jack. What they would do is, rather than straight making everything have black outlines, so that's another benefit I was talking before. If you make everything fills beforehand, then you can start making artistic decisions on what you want your strokes to be and not maybe be shoehorned into whatever's already there. So let's say I take this shirt, I'll make a new layer and I'll call it maybe color outlines. And so I have the same color from before. I'll double click it right there, and so this is the color that the shirt is, but then I can say maybe I want lighter outlines in the color of the fill, or I want darker outlines in what the shirt is. And so I'll take that and I will select it. I'll take that exact color that I created in this box right here, and then you can just drag it into that group. So this is the new group. Because I created those swatches from before, I can fix what ended up happening. So I select the shirt, I change the fill to be what I wanted, I select the outline, the stroke box, and then I put the darker stroke right there. Or conversely, like I said before, you can make it lighter. It all depends on what you want to do. And then one other thing, which could be, reminds me of what I was telling you before. So if you go back to the Dropbox files that I gave you, if you look at this flannel suede, I said it backwards, texture, you can start to think about how you can apply different texture to your Illustrator creations, similar to how you would do in 3ds Max. And so what you can do is if you import it either by placing it or by dragging it in like I said before, and what you want to do is you want to embed it into the file. So what this will do is it'll make your file a good deal bigger, because the way Illustrator manages bitmaps is that it saves it, I believe, on a per pixel basis, so it starts to get fairly large. But by embedding it, you can do cool things like you can drag it into your swatches. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be working for me. I think I have a file where I did have it working before, though. So you can notice because I embedded that texture file, it made things a bit bigger. But what can happen, which unfortunately it's not showing it, but I know it's there, is if I create that texture, and if you notice right here, in the fill, there's this gradient. I really don't know why it's doing this on my side. Okay, so what you can do is if you drag it and you create that gradient swatch, what you can do is you can put it directly on top of your shirt. And that'll allow you to put additional detail into your creation. I guess the last thing I'll do is it'll end up being a bit rushed. But something that I was doing on the side, because I heard that you guys were working on logo creation, is I'll do something real quick. And this is similar to what I was showing you before. So if you take something, text is usually big for logo, so I'll just say, so I wrote NJIT SIGGRAPH. I may have spelled it wrong. I think I did. You can Control Shift to make it bigger. I did. And depending on whatever font you use, what may end up happening is if you send it out to printers or other places that may not necessarily have the same font that you have, if you select your font and you go to Object, Path, let me see. Or actually, this is probably the easier way to do it. If you select it, I think it's under Type. It's under Type and then Create Outlines. What it'll do is it'll give you the exact shape. So if you look up like the NJIT logo in particular, they have letters within it. But then, because not everybody has the font, or like I said before, they don't want it so that when you scale things, things change. Like if maybe the bold looks different on a different font size. If you have an actual shape, then you can give your files out that way, and you can also apply different effects to it, like if you want to add a gradient to it or a glow effect. This tutorial was brought to you by NJIT SIGGRAPH. Your presenter was AJ Polanco. We hope that you'll continue to watch this and other videos as they are created. Thank you, and have a good day.